All things considered, humanity is still at a very primitive stage of development. And in a previous video, I've talked about how time is not a linear thing that we experience. Rather, time is a frequency. And the absolute future, in other words, the point at which time dissolves, is the unification of all things. So the further you go into the future, in other words, the further you tap into a vibration of the absolute future, the closer you get to that, so to speak, the more you're going to be tapped into a unified state of consciousness, and a consciousness that's very integrated, where you're going to be able to see the different levels of development and how, honestly, if you tap into this frequency, you can see about where humanity is and about where the masses might fall within this spectrum of consciousness that leads all the way up to the absolute unification of everything. So with that, let's think about how our history and where we are today, most of the world is looking out to something. Most of the people in the world are looking up to some god, they're looking out to some deity, whether they're religious or whether they're spiritual, they're looking outside of themselves. They're looking for something that is the self. Now, this is honestly how history has been ever since whether or not cavemen were real, and that's a whole other topic. But whether we go back and we look at how the stages of human development back when humans were conceived of, essentially, and in this story of humanity's conception, which was the Adam and Eve thing, which was rather than just some biblical story, it was more like a terrarium in which the Anunnaki actually created humans, and they made them to be servants. They designed these humans to be servants, and then there's this whole story about how Enki, one of the Anunnaki, came through, and he altered the DNA in order to give humans the same connection to the Supreme that the Anunnaki had. In other words, leveling the playing field, so they're no longer just these organic servant beings. But the thing about this was that humans as a whole never really actualized that potential. Sure, there were some that did and some that do, but as a whole, humanity was always still looking out to the gods. And these were still the Anunnaki back then. This was your Yahweh. This was, all of them that go through the different points of time. The Roman gods, the Egyptian gods, things like that. Most of these were just the Anunnaki with different names. And they look to these beings and they look to them like they're the gods, they're the saviors, we serve them. Even though we had the capacity within our DNA to actually activate ourselves and be the gods ourselves. So if we come forward in time to where we are now, still it is the case that most of the world is worshiping something. They're looking out to something and they're looking to that thing. We have yet to reach an era where it is the era of the self. Now I want you to think about an advanced civilization for a second, such as the Anunnaki, right? They were here and they were literally like breeding creations. Like humans are a result of them. And this was a society that they were deemed gods because they were more in an era, at least I assume, of the self, where they're not looking for something to worship because they see themselves as, well, I am the god, I am the supreme being, I am the self. And that's why to all that are lost, they look like the shining light that people look to, and people look to that light, and then that sort of like, there's your caste system, right? So my point here with all of this is that until humanity reaches this age of self-awareness, we are living in a very primitive world. We're still living in this phase where people are not ready to see themselves in the very literal sense. They're not willing to see the self. They're not willing to accept the self, the being, the eternal being that is within us. People really externalize their power so much that it causes this distortion in the world where everything that is built of human hands, of people that are in this state of consciousness, reflects this disconnection. Whether it be the energy that we're using, whether it be like the kind of leaders and the kind of systems that we're using, that all reflects the disconnection from self that exists, like I said, within us. It's because we're worshiping these external things that all these distortions happen. And in many cases, this is the irony of it, that these external gods that are being worshipped, they are not the self, right? So if you're looking to something, if you're calling upon God or whatever it is to come and do whatever it is for you. You're trying to bring in a power, an entity to come and do some task for you, which is essentially what prayer is. Then what you're doing is you're externalizing yourself, and you're basically forming a covenant with something outside of you in order for that thing to swoop down and come and do something. But this comes at a cost, because it's transactional. So this comes at a cost of your energy, of your awareness. In order to live in a paradigm like that within yourself, you have to have a certain level of disconnection from the actual truth. Now this, my friends, many people don't want to hear it, but you don't need these things outside of yourself. If you were to truly just tap into yourself and stop waiting for something outside of you to come and like say, oh, this is God's plan, or this is this and that, and because of that I'm waiting for something to come and do something for me. Honestly, I feel like this is a mental disease among people who are they're waiting for the right thing to happen, and they're waiting for some other being other than themselves to come and like take care of something for them. And this is that level of, like I said, primitive consciousness that sort of envelops our world right now. So with this, my friends, recognize that the power is within you. But we have to dig deep and actually find all the different levels of programming that have led us to separate from ourselves. You're not actually waiting for anything to come and do anything for you. Now, I'm not saying there's not a divine timeline, so to speak, of things in your life. But if you were to think of this more like stages of development, rather than like, oh, I'm waiting for God to do this for me, to set this up for me, you're going to put yourself in a better place. Like think about a tree seed. You put that tree in the ground and it's not going to be like a tree immediately, but that tree's not sitting in the ground and it's like, well, when God comes down and turns me into a tree, then I'll be a tree. No, the tree just has to go through the process of rooting itself into the ground and then taking in water and then taking in sunlight and breathing and getting bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually that becomes a full-grown tree. It matures into what it is. Now, this is the essence of the self that people are really overlooking, and they're externalizing it because they're not ready to understand that they are the same thing as the thing that they worship. I'll say that again. People are not ready to understand, to believe that they are the same thing that they're worshiping. They're looking outside of themselves because they're like, well, I couldn't possibly be that. Now, this was one of the teachings of Isu, which is Jesus, that people really get wrong, because this being who was another one of the Anunnaki. So just for reference, he incarnated into a probably human, possibly hybrid vessel to come down here and to help the humans who now had this capacity to actually tap into the supreme being, but they were still worshiping something. They weren't activated. So this being said, well, I'm going to incarnate into this vessel so I can go and I can lead them to themselves. And obviously this didn't work, right? His mission failed because instead of people learning from his lessons and saying like, oh, this guy was actually here to teach us that we're the same thing as he is, and we have the same capacity and the same potential, assuming we do the right things and assuming we put things in the correct framework. But people were so primitive in their consciousness that they're just like, oh, well, bow down. He is the Holy One and I am not the Holy One, because that can't possibly exist within me because he can do miracles and I can't do miracles. That's the level of disconnection, my friends. People are so externalized, and this just tells us how primitive humanity actually is right now. So for those of you that are tapped in and are resonating with what I'm saying and can see these pictures and have that intimate connection with self within you, you're actually living in the future. And if you're living in the future, I'm not saying that you're like outside of the now, like you're being delusional about it, but I'm saying you are literally the frequency of the future. And you're anchoring that in the now just by being in that space. When people talk to you, when people interact with you, and you are holding that frequency, there are chords within them, which is the DNA that has been in play since our origins. These resonate with the frequency that we're able to carry when we're tapped into that timeline of unity and of self-recollection. So when you embody that and others come around you, you vibrate those chords within them. Sometimes they can be very buried in programming and in all sorts of who knows what, traumas probably. But it still resonates. It still vibrates when you come into contact with that, which is what sympathetic resonance is, which is what I've mentioned before. If I were to sing a specific note and there was an instrument in the room that had a string that was tuned to that same note, it would resonate with that note that I'm singing. It would find a frequency that's close enough to that, and because those frequencies would match of the tension that string is holding and then the tone that is being resonated, it's going to resonate without me touching it. That's what our frequency does. That's how potent our frequency is. And that's also why they want to keep this frequency repressed. It's why religion, in this sense of like even spirituality, the New Age spirituality, has been weaponized because they want to keep people externalized. They want to keep people talking to spirits that are outside of them and forming these covenants, because so long as they do, they won't realize that they're powerful on their own. And I'm not saying all spirits are bad. I'm not saying all entities outside of you are bad. And I'm not saying that you're probably not plugged in with some greater collective of ancestors that live beyond this physical realm, and you're a piece of that. What I am saying, though, is that when you see something outside of you, just because it's a spirit or something like that, as more holy, more whole, which is literally what that word means, than you are not whole, right? Let me word that in a more clear way. If you are not seeing that you are the complete self within you, and you're looking outside of you and you say, well, that's the complete self, so clearly I am not, so I need that thing in order to fulfill myself, then you are fragmenting yourself, my friends. We have to know that we are the supreme being, we are the creator, but we're that creator here having a human experience. But the soul within us, the spirit, the self within us is complete. It is whole. It is unified, and it is tuned into that timeline of absolute future in which consciousness reaches that point of singularity, right? So, my friends, that is the journey, and that is the mission, because the more we tap into that and the more we just be what that is, the more others naturally around us might get tapped into that. And then they start questioning things, because the frequency, imagine you had these cords and they were just packed with mud. And eventually you started vibrating them just a little bit. Just a little bit. You'd get little pieces that would chip off and chip off and chip off and chip off. Now all this mud is representative of their programming, of their belief systems that aren't serving them, but they don't recognize that they're not serving them. So the more that cord vibrates, the more this mud starts to chip off until now it's resonating. Now it's awake, now it's alive, now it's actually resonating that same frequency, and you and I are in unison, right? I hope that makes sense, my friends. So with that, I just wanted to remind you all today that we are quite literally beings that are living in the future and anchoring that into the now. We're on a timeline that is the future, and we're bringing that to the now through our resonance and through our wisdom, through the knowledge that we can convey and connect with one another. And when that becomes potent enough, when enough of us are resonating on that frequency, that's when we actually bring about a world that is in alignment with what that actually is. Like I said, my friends, it is the way the world is shaped around fragmented consciousness that is the reason why everything is so messed up and there's all this craziness going on, because humanity is fragmented. As above, so below. The as above, in other words, the as within, I should say, is fragmented and it is externalized. So now we're seeing the fragmentation outside of ourselves. So those of us that are tapped in are like, what is with this madhouse? Right? Like, what's with this craziness? Because we're tapped into the unification. We're tapped into the calm. We're tapped into the balance. So my friends, tap in, stay with it, stay strong, and keep your feet on the ground. A lot of times life will test you and it will try to pull you back out of your center, and we have to recognize what we are, who we are, what we're doing. Because when we understand the why behind it, then we can really not be thrown off. At least if we do get thrown off, we know how to come back because we have the wisdom. We have the knowledge. So my friends, with that, I wish you all well. If you connect with this message at all, like, subscribe, feel free to comment. Let me know your thoughts. And be whole, my friends. All right? Take care. We'll talk soon.